Today, we're embarking on an epic journey through time. Over the next couple of hours, we'll traverse millennia, from the mists of prehistoric Britain, right up to the 21st century we inhabit today, exploring the history of an island nation that has profoundly shaped the world, Great Britain. From the ancient stones of Stonehenge to the edge of the Roman Empire, from the warring kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons to the seismic shifts of the Norman Conquest, from the clashes of medieval knights to the religious turmoil of the Tudors, from the smokestacks of the Industrial Revolution to the global reach of the British Empire, through the crucible of two world wars, the building of the welfare state, and the challenges and transformations of modern society, including the recent chapter of Brexit. All of this drama unfolded on these relatively small islands off the coast of Europe. This is a story packed with legend, conflict, innovation, and glory, but also one marked by controversy, contradiction, and decline. It's a history that not only forged the Britain of today, but also left an indelible mark on the world through its political systems, legal frameworks, scientific breakthroughs, literary masterpieces, and even its way of life. Are you ready? Fasten your temporal seatbelts. Our journey through British history begins now. We'll proceed chronologically, divided into 8 chapters, to unravel this vast and fascinating saga. Chapter 1. Ancient Foundations, Prehistory, Celts, and Roman Britain. Our story begins long, long ago, in the depths of prehistory. The British Isles weren't always islands. During the last ice age, a land bridge connected them to continental Europe. It was only around 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers melted and sea levels rose, that the English Channel formed, isolating Britain as the island group we know today. The earliest human footprints date back hundreds of thousands of years to the Paleolithic era, but we're more familiar with the inhabitants of the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, the people who left behind truly monumental legacies. Imagine around 3000 BC, without modern tools, how did people manage to quarry, transport, and erect those colossal stones, weighing dozens of tons, on Salisbury Plain to create the enigmatic Stonehenge? To this day, its exact purpose, an astronomical observatory, a religious temple, a tribal gathering place, remains debated, but it undeniably proves the existence of a society with remarkable organization and engineering skills. Stonehenge isn't alone. Sites like the vast Avebury Stone Circle and the remarkably preserved Neolithic village of Skara Brae in the Orkney Islands offer glimpses into the lives and social complexity of Britain's early inhabitants. Moving into the Iron Age, from around 800 BC, groups of tribes we collectively call the Celts migrated from continental Europe, gradually spreading across the British Isles. It's important to remember that Celts wasn't a unified nation, but rather a collection of diverse tribes sharing similar languages, part of the Celtic language family, intricate art styles, like the swirling Latin style, and cultural practices. They were fierce warriors, skilled metalworkers, and left behind beautiful artifacts. Their society was tribal, led by chiefs or kings, with druids playing significant roles in their religious and spiritual life. Before the Romans arrived, Celtic culture was dominant. Stories like that of Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe, leading a fiery revolt against Roman rule, echo down the centuries, showcasing Celtic pride and resistance. In 55 and 54 BC, the Roman Republic's Julius Caesar made 2 brief expeditions to Britain. These were largely reconnaissance missions and political maneuvering, rather than attempts at lasting conquest. The real subjugation began nearly a century later. In 43 AD, Emperor Claudius ordered a full-scale invasion. The highly organized and disciplined Roman legions gradually conquered most of modern-day England and Wales, incorporating it into the vast Roman Empire as the province of Britannia. Roman rule lasted for almost 4 centuries c. 43 AD c. 410 AD. During this time, the Romans brought their language, Latin, which influenced English, laws, architecture, engineering, roads, urban planning, and way of life. Many famous British cities, like London Londinium, York, Eboracum, and Bath Aquisulis, were founded or significantly developed during the Roman period. They constructed an impressive network of Roman roads, facilitating communication and trade across the province. To defend the northern frontier against unconquered tribes like the Picts, Emperor Hadrian commissioned the famous Hadrian's Wall around 122 AD, a massive fortification stretching across northern England, still a potent symbol of Roman power. However, Romanization wasn't total. In the countryside, Celtic culture remained strong. Roman influence was most concentrated in the lowland areas of England. Wales and especially Scotland, known to the Romans as Caledonia, were never fully subdued. What emerged was a unique Romano-British culture, a blend of imported and native traditions. Christianity also arrived during the later Roman period and began to take root. But the glory of Rome wasn't eternal. From the 3rd century AD onwards, the empire faced increasing internal strife and external pressures on its borders. To deal with crises on the continent, the Roman legions were gradually withdrawn from Britain, with the final departure around 410 AD. Rome's exit left a power vacuum. The Romano-British inhabitants, accustomed to Roman protection, found themselves vulnerable. Towns declined, the Roman administrative structure crumbled, Britain was once again exposed to threats from sea and land, and the island's history was about to enter a turbulent new phase, often called the Dark Ages. Yet the Roman legacy, the roads, the foundations of cities, Latin loanwords in English, and the seeds of Christianity, would continue to shape the land's future. That covers our first chapter. From the prehistoric mysteries of Stonehenge, through the vibrant era of the Celts, to the conquest and legacy of Roman Britain. These ancient layers form the bedrock of British history. Next, we'll journey into the age of the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, witnessing the birth of England amidst chaos and invasion. Chapter 2: Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, Kingdom Formation and Invasions. After the Roman legions departed, Britain entered a period of profound upheaval and reshaping. The Romano-British population, lacking Roman military protection, struggled to defend themselves against new waves of incomers. Starting in the 5th century AD, Germanic tribes from northwestern Europe, primarily the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began migrating and settling in eastern and southern Britain in large numbers. These Germanic settlers are collectively known as the Anglo-Saxons. They brought their own languages, Old English, the direct ancestor of modern English, social structures, legal customs, and pagan beliefs. They engaged in prolonged conflict and eventual fusion with the native Celtic Britons, whom the Anglo-Saxons called Welsh, meaning foreigner or slave. The Britons were gradually pushed westwards into what is now Wales, northwards into Scotland, and southwest into Cornwall, or were assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society. The enduring legends of King Arthur are thought by many to have originated in this period, possibly reflecting the resistance of Romano-British leaders against the Anglo-Saxon advance. Though concrete historical evidence remains elusive, the Anglo-Saxons weren't a single unified force. They established numerous independent kingdoms across the land. By the 7th century, 7 major kingdoms had emerged, a period often referred to as the Heptarchy. These were Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex in the south and southeast, and Wessex in the southwest. These kingdoms constantly vied for dominance, forming shifting alliances and engaging in warfare. Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex each enjoyed periods as the most powerful kingdom. Culturally, this era wasn't entirely dark. Christianity experienced a resurgence in Britain. From Ireland, Celtic monks like Street Columba, who founded the influential monastery on Iona off the coast of Scotland, spread the faith in the north. Meanwhile, in 597 AD, Pope Gregory the Great sent a mission led by St. Augustine to Kent. Augustine successfully converted King Ethelbert and established the first archbishopric at Canterbury, which remains the symbolic head of the Church of England. For a time, Celtic and Roman Christian traditions differed, e.g., on the calculation of Easter. But at the Synod of Whitby in 664, the English Church decided to align with Roman practices. The spread of Christianity brought a revival of learning and scholarship. Monasteries became centers of culture, where monks copied manuscripts and preserved knowledge. Northumbria enjoyed a cultural golden age in the 7th and 8th centuries, producing scholars like the Venerable Bede, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people is a vital source for early English history. The epic poem Beowulf, reflecting the heroic society of the time, was composed during the Anglo-Saxon period. Exquisite artifacts like the Lindisfarne Gospels and the treasures discovered in the Sutton Hoo ship burial demonstrate the high level of artistry achieved. However, just as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were developing and Christian culture was flourishing, a new threat emerged from the sea. From the late 8th century onwards, warriors and sailors from Scandinavia, known as Vikings, primarily Danes and Norwegians, began raiding the coasts of Britain. The brutal sack of the Lindisfarne monastery in 793 is often seen as the start of the Viking Age in Britain. Initially, the Vikings were seasonal raiders, plundering wealthy monasteries and coastal settlements. But from the mid-9th century, their ambitions shifted from plunder to conquest and settlement. In 865, a massive Viking force, known in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia and began a large-scale invasion of England. Over the next decade, they destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia, conquering almost all of England. Facing annihilation, the last surviving major Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Wessex, mounted a determined resistance under the leadership of King Alfred the Great. Alfred was an exceptional figure, a skilled warrior, a capable administrator, and a patron of learning. In 878, he won a decisive victory against the Viking leader Guthrum at the Battle of Edington. This led to the Treaty of Wedmore, which partitioned England. Wessex and its dependencies remained under Anglo-Saxon rule, while the northeast of England came under Danish control, an area known as the Danelaw. Alfred didn't just save Wessex, he implemented crucial reforms. He reorganized the army, creating a standing force and a navy. He built a network of fortified towns called Buzz. He codified laws. He also spearheaded a revival of learning and literacy, translating important Latin texts into Old English himself. Alfred's resilience and vision laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England, earning him the title the Great. Alfred's successors, his son Edward the Elder and grandson Athelstan, continued the fight against the Danelaw. In 927, Athelstan conquered Northumbria, bringing all of England under one ruler for the first time. He is widely regarded as the first true king of England. By the mid-10th century, the House of Wessex had largely reconquered the Danelaw. However, the Viking threat hadn't vanished. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, new waves of Danish invasions occurred. The English king, Athelred the Unready, meaning ill-advised, not unprepared, resorted to paying vast sums of protection money, known as Danegeld, which proved ineffective and financially crippling. Eventually, in 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard conquered England. After Sweyn's death, his son Nut the Great defeated Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, in 1016 and became king of England. Nut later also ruled Denmark and Norway, creating a vast North Sea empire. His reign in England was relatively peaceful and stable. He embraced Christianity and respected English laws and customs. Nut's sons failed to maintain his empire. In 1042, the Anglo-Saxon royal line was restored with the accession of Athelred the Unready's son, Edward the Confessor. Edward was a pious king, but died childless in January 1066. His lack of an heir set the stage for a three-way struggle for the English throne involving England, Normandy, and Norway, leading to one of the most pivotal events in British history, the Norman Conquest. That concludes Chapter 2. From the power vacuum left by Rome to the rise and fall of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. From the resurgence of Christianity and culture to the terrifying onslaught of the Vikings. From Alfred the Great's heroic defense to the first unification of England and the brief interlude of Danish rule. This turbulent era forged England's ethnic core, linguistic foundations, and political geography. Next, we arrive at the fateful year of 1066 and enter the Middle Ages transformed by the Norman Conquest. Chapter 3, Norman Conquest and the Middle Ages, Transformation, Monarchy, and Conflict. The year 1066 is a watershed moment in British history. In January, the childless King Edward the Confessor died, triggering a major succession crisis. Three main contenders emerged: Harold Godwin's son, Edward's powerful brother-in-law, and a leading Anglo-Saxon earl. William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had previously promised him the throne, and Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, who based his claim on earlier agreements. The English Witenagemot, or Council of Leading Men, chose Harold Godwin's son as king. However, both William and Harald Hardrada prepared invasion forces. Harold first marched north to confront the Norwegian invasion, winning a stunning victory at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in late September, where Hardrada was killed. But just 3 days later, news arrived that William's Norman fleet had landed on the south coast. Harold had to force march his exhausted army southwards. On October 14, 1066, at the famous Battle of Hastings, King Harold was killed, and the Anglo-Saxon army was decisively defeated. William, Duke of Normandy, emerged victorious. On Christmas Day of the same year, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, forever known as William the Conqueror. This event is the Norman Conquest. The Norman Conquest had profound and lasting consequences for England, transforming almost every aspect of society, political and social structure. William systematically replaced the Anglo-Saxon ruling class with Norman barons and clergy. He introduced and solidified the system of feudalism prevalent on the continent. The king was the ultimate owner of all land, granting estates fiefs to his loyal Norman tenants-in-chief in return for military service and counsel. These barons, in turn, granted land to lesser knights and lords. This hierarchical system fundamentally reshaped England's power structure. To understand the resources of his new kingdom, William commissioned an unprecedented nationwide survey of land ownership and wealth in 1086, compiled in the Domesday Book, an invaluable historical record that survives to this day. Language and culture. The Norman rulers spoke Norman French, which became the language of the court, government, law, and high society. The common people continued to speak Old English. Over the following centuries, these two languages merged and evolved, creating Middle English and eventually Modern English. Thousands of French words entered the English vocabulary, particularly in areas like law, politics, warfare, and cuisine. The Normans also brought their architectural style, Romanesque, later evolving into Gothic. They built numerous imposing castles, like the Tower of London and Windsor Castle, and magnificent cathedrals and abbeys, such as Durham Cathedral and Canterbury Cathedral, across England, serving as symbols of power and control, as well as military strongholds. Law and administration. The Norman monarchy strengthened central government and created a more efficient administrative system. While some Anglo-Saxon legal customs were retained, Norman legal practices, including early forms of trial by jury, were introduced. The authority of royal courts expanded, laying the foundations for the development of England's unique common law system. Law based on custom and judicial precedent, rather than solely on statute. William the Conqueror and his immediate successors, William II and Henry I, consolidated Norman rule. However, struggles over succession and power continued. After Henry I's only legitimate son died, a bitter civil war erupted between his daughter Matilda and his nephew Stephen, 1135 to 1154. Known as the Anarchy, this devastating conflict ended with a compromise. Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, was named as Stephen's heir. In 1154, Henry II ascended the throne, founding the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry was an energetic and capable ruler who controlled not only England, but also vast territories in western France, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, etc., through inheritance and marriage, creating the extensive Angevin Empire. He implemented major judicial reforms, strengthening royal courts and standardizing legal procedures through itinerant justices, significantly advancing the development of common law. However, his attempts to assert royal authority over the church led to a famous and bitter conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, culminating in Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, a shocking event that reverberated across Europe. Henry II's sons, Richard I, the Lionheart, and John, Lackland, presided over more turbulent times. Richard spent most of his reign fighting abroad on the Third Crusade, or defending his French territories, showing little interest in governing England. King John, however, proved deeply unpopular. He lost most of the Plantagenet lands in France, hence Lackland, and his arbitrary rule and heavy taxation provoked widespread baronial discontent. In 1215, facing a baronial revolt, King John was forced to meet the barons at Runnymede and affix his seal to a landmark document, Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Magna Carta aimed to limit the king's power, protect the privileges of the barons and the church, and establish fundamental legal principles, such as the idea that the king himself is subject to the law, and that no free man could be punished arbitrarily without due process. Although its initial beneficiaries were primarily the elite, the principles it enshrined, rule of law, and the limitation of arbitrary power, had immense long-term significance for the development of constitutional government in Britain and around the world. It is considered a cornerstone of the British Constitution. Over the following centuries, England's parliament gradually evolved. Initially, kings occasionally summoned great councils of barons and bishops for advice and consent to taxation. In the 13th century, particularly under Henry III and his son Edward I, Parliament's composition and powers grew. Edward I, needing funds for his wars, began regularly summoning representatives not just of the nobility and clergy, House of Lords, but also knights from the shires and burgesses from the towns, House of Commons. Parliament gradually acquired the crucial powers to approve taxation and assent to legislation, becoming a vital institution for checking royal power and representing broader interests. Edward I also completed the conquest of Wales, imposing English law and administration, and building formidable castles, like Carnarvon. He bestowed the title Prince of Wales on his eldest son, a tradition that continues today. His attempts to conquer Scotland, however, provoked fierce resistance led by figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, ultimately securing Scottish independence after the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314. The 14th and 15th centuries were dominated by the protracted Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France, fought ostensibly over claims to the French throne. It also involved territorial disputes and economic rivalries. The war saw stunning English victories, often due to the superiority of the English longbowmen, at battles like Crecy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. However, the conflict was immensely costly. The emergence of Joan of Arc revitalized the French cause, and England ultimately lost all its continental possessions except for Calais. The war, however, fostered a stronger sense of English national identity, and the English language gradually replaced French in official and literary circles. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales being a prime example of Middle English literature. Meanwhile, the mid-14th century witnessed the devastation of the Black Death, bubonic plague, which wiped out roughly a third to a half of England's population. This catastrophe profoundly altered the socio-economic landscape, leading to severe labor shortages, rising wages, the accelerated decline of serfdom, and social unrest, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 led by Wat Tyler. Shortly after the end of the Hundred Years' War, England descended into another prolonged internal conflict, the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1487. This was a brutal dynastic struggle for the throne between two rival branches of the Plantagenet family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white rose. The wars decimated the old nobility and caused great instability. The conflict finally ended in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where the Lancastrian claimant Henry Tudor defeated and killed the Yorkist king Richard III. Henry Tudor ascended the throne as Henry VII, married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, and founded the Tudor dynasty. The end of the Wars of the Roses marked the close of the English Middle Ages and ushered in a new era. That concludes Chapter 3. The Norman Conquest brought revolutionary changes, shaping England's feudal structure, language, culture, and legal system. Magna Carta and the rise of Parliament planted the seeds of limited monarchy and constitutionalism. And through the crucible of the Hundred Years' War, and the Wars of the Roses. A stronger English identity was forged, paving the way for the powerful Tudor monarchy. Next, we enter the age of the Tudors and Stuarts, witnessing the dramatic events of the Reformation and Revolution. Chapter 4: Tudors and Stuarts, Reformation and Revolution. Henry VII, reigned 1485 to 1509, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, faced the immediate tasks of ending decades of civil war, consolidating royal authority, restoring national order, and rebuilding the crown's finances. He proved to be a shrewd and capable ruler, curbing the power of overmighty nobles, encouraging trade, and amassing a considerable treasury, laying a solid foundation for Tudor power. His son, Henry VIII, reigned 1509 to 1547, is one of the most iconic, controversial, and transformative monarchs in English history. Charismatic and athletic in his youth, he became increasingly autocratic and ruthless later in life. The defining event of his reign was undoubtedly the English Reformation. Initially, Henry was a staunch defender of Catholicism, even being awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope for writing against Martin Luther. However, his desire to annul his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had failed to produce a male heir, and Mary Ann Boleyn, met with papal refusal. Determined to resolve the king's great matter, Henry took the radical step of breaking away from the authority of the Pope in Rome through a series of parliamentary acts. Most notably the Act of Supremacy in 1534, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, Anglican Church. This break was driven more by political and personal ambition than by deep theological conviction. Henry remained doctrinally conservative in many ways. Subsequently, Henry ordered the dissolution of the monasteries, seizing their vast lands and wealth for the crown, or distributing them to supportive nobles, which significantly boosted royal finances and power. Henry VIII famously married 6 times, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, in his relentless quest for a male heir, ultimately fathering 1 son, Edward, and 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. His marital dramas and the religious upheaval he initiated brought immense turmoil and profound change to English society. Following Henry VIII's death, his young son Edward VI, reigned 1547 to 1553, succeeded him. Under the influence of Protestant counselors, the Church of England moved further in a Protestant, Calvinist direction, with more radical reforms, including the introduction of the English-language Book of Common Prayer. Edward VI died young. An attempt to divert the succession to the Protestant Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, failed. Henry VIII's eldest daughter, Mary I, reigned 1553 to 1558, took the throne. Mary was a devout Catholic and determined to restore Catholicism as the state religion. She repealed the Protestant legislation of her father and brother and launched a fierce persecution of Protestants, burning nearly 300 at the stake, earning her the grim nickname Bloody Mary. Her reign was short, unpopular, and she died childless. Mary was succeeded by her half-sister and Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I, reigned 1558 to 1603. Elizabeth's long reign is often hailed as England's golden age. She was an exceptionally intelligent and politically astute queen, facing deep religious divisions at home and threats from Catholic powers abroad, especially Spain and France. She pursued a pragmatic religious policy, known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. This re-established the Church of England's independence from Rome, but sought a moderate middle way, via media, between Catholic traditions and radical Protestantism, Puritanism. While it didn't fully satisfy extremists on either side, it brought relative stability. Under Elizabeth, England grew in confidence and stature. Arts and literature flourished, producing giants like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser. Maritime exploration and trade expanded, with figures like Sir Francis Drake circumnavigating the globe and challenging Spanish dominance at sea. The defining moment came in 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. A combination of English naval tactics and favorable weather scattered and destroyed the supposedly invincible Spanish fleet sent to invade England. This victory was a massive boost to national morale and marked the rise of English sea power. Elizabeth I never married, famously remaining the Virgin Queen, and left no direct heir. Upon her death in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended. As prearranged, the throne passed to her cousin, King James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, reigned 1603 to 1625. He was the great-grandson of Henry VII and son of Mary, Queen of Scots. His accession brought about the union of the crowns of England and Scotland, though the two kingdoms remained separate entities with their own parliaments and laws for another century. Inaugurating the Stuart dynasty in England. The Stuart monarchs, starting with James I, strongly believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs derive their authority directly from God and are not accountable to earthly powers like Parliament. This belief inevitably clashed with the growing assertiveness of the English Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, which sought greater influence. Under James I, friction grew over issues of taxation, religious policy, especially the treatment of Puritans who wanted further Protestant reforms, and foreign affairs. The infamous Gunpowder Plot of 1605, a failed attempt by Catholic conspirators to blow up Parliament and the King, further heightened religious tensions. The conflict intensified under James I's son, Charles I, reigned 1625 to 1649. Charles fully embraced the doctrine of divine right, levied taxes without parliamentary consent, and attempted to impose religious uniformity, based on practices seen as too close to Catholicism by many, on both England and Scotland, provoking armed rebellion in Scotland, the Bishops' Wars. Forced to seek funds to fight the Scots, Charles reluctantly recalled Parliament in 1640, the Long Parliament. Parliament seized the opportunity to demand major concessions, asserting its rights through measures like the Petition of Right, which Charles had earlier accepted but ignored, abolishing prerogative courts, and demanding regular sessions. Compromise proved impossible, and in 1642, England descended into civil war. The conflict pitted the Royalists' Cavaliers, supporting the king, against the parliamentarians' Roundheads. Under the military leadership of Oliver Cromwell, the parliamentarians formed the highly disciplined and effective New Model Army, which ultimately defeated the Royalist forces. In January 1649, Charles I was tried by a High Court of Justice established by Parliament, convicted of treason, and publicly executed. This unprecedented act, the execution of a reigning monarch by his own subjects, sent shockwaves across Europe and shattered the mystique of divine right. England was declared a Commonwealth, a republic, initially governed by Parliament. However, divisions persisted, and Cromwell, backed by the army, eventually dissolved the Rump Parliament and in 1653 became Lord Protector, establishing a form of military dictatorship known as the Protectorate. Cromwell's rule was marked by Puritan austerity at home, but also by effective foreign policy and military successes against the Dutch and Spanish. Cromwell died in 1658, and his son Richard proved unable to maintain control. After a period of instability, the army and leading politicians decided to restore the monarchy. In 1660, Charles I's exiled son returned as Charles II, reigned 1660 to 1685, an event known as the Restoration. The Restoration era saw a reaction against Puritan severity, with Charles II known as the Merry Monarch. Parliament's power was largely restored, and the foundations of modern political parties, Whigs and Tories, began to emerge. However, underlying tensions over religion and the balance of power between king and parliament remained. Charles II harbored Catholic sympathies and maintained secret ties with Louis XIV of France. The real crisis erupted under his brother and successor, James II, reigned 1685 to 1688. James was an openly practicing Catholic and aggressively sought to restore Catholicism to prominence, appointing Catholics to high office and attempting to suspend laws discriminating against them. This alienated the predominantly Protestant political establishment, both Whigs and Tories. When James's Catholic second wife gave birth to a son in 1688, raising the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty, opposition reached boiling point. In 1688, A group of influential political and religious leaders secretly invited James II Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, William of Orange, the Protestant stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, and also James II nephew, to bring an army to England to defend Protestantism and English liberties. When William landed, James II's support collapsed, and he fled to France. This largely bloodless coup is known as the Glorious Revolution. In 1689, Parliament passed the crucial Bill of Rights. This landmark act decisively established the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. It affirmed that the monarch could not suspend laws, levy taxes, or maintain a standing army without Parliament's consent, guaranteed parliamentary free speech, and protected basic rights like the right to petition. William III and Mary II accepted these terms and ruled as joint monarchs. The Bill of Rights, alongside Magna Carta and the evolving parliamentary system, cemented the foundations of Britain's constitutional monarchy. The Glorious Revolution effectively ended the long struggle between Crown and Parliament, shifting the balance of power irrevocably towards Parliament. That concludes Chapter 4. The Tudor dynasty brought the Reformation and national consolidation, but also sowed seeds of religious conflict. The Stuarts' attempts at absolutism triggered civil war, a republican experiment, and finally the Glorious Revolution, which established parliamentary supremacy and constitutional monarchy, paving the way for Britain's future stability, development, and expansion. Next, we enter the Georgian era, witnessing the rise of the British Empire, the transformative wave of the Industrial Revolution, and global expansion. Chapter 5: Georgian Britain and the Rise of Empire, Industrial Revolution and Global Expansion. Following the Glorious Revolution, the Stuart dynasty lingered briefly. After William III and Mary II, Mary's sister Queen Anne, reigned 1702 to 1714, took the throne. The most significant achievement of her reign was the Acts of Union in 1707, which formally merged the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland into a single state. The Kingdom of Great Britain, sharing one monarch and one parliament at Westminster. This marked the birth of the modern British state as a unified political entity, and was the last Stuart monarch. Tragically, none of her many children survived infancy. Under the terms of the Act of Settlement, passed in 1701 to ensure a Protestant succession and exclude Catholics. Upon Anne's death, the throne passed to the German Protestant descendants of James I's daughter, specifically to George I, reigned 1714 to 1727, the Elector of Hanover. This inaugurated the Hanoverian dynasty, and the period often known as the Georgian era, typically covering the reigns of George I to George IV, 1714 to 1830, sometimes extended to include William IV. George I and his successor George II were German princes, unfamiliar with British politics, and arguably less interested in the day-to-day running of the country. George I barely spoke English. This detachment inadvertently fostered the development of the cabinet system and the office of the Prime Minister. The monarch increasingly delegated executive power to a small group of ministers drawn from the majority party in Parliament. The leading figure in this cabinet, like Sir Robert Walpole, who dominated politics for roughly 2 decades, circa 1721 to 1742, came to be regarded as the first de facto prime minister. Walpole pursued policies of peace abroad and financial stability at home, creating a favorable environment for Britain's later growth. The Georgian era was a time of profound social, economic, and cultural transformation. The ideas of the Enlightenment circulated widely in Britain. Thinkers like John Locke, whose philosophy heavily influenced the Glorious Revolution and later the American Declaration of Independence, Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations laid the foundations of classical economics, and David Hume made groundbreaking contributions in political philosophy, economics, and empiricism. Scientific inquiry flourished, building on Newton's legacy. Society became more open, with coffee houses serving as hubs for intellectual exchange, the rise of newspapers and magazines fostering public opinion. Distinctive Georgian architecture, elegant Palladian and neoclassical styles, furniture like Chippendale, and art, paintings by Hogarth Gainsborough Reynolds, also defined the era. However, the most defining features of the Georgian era were undoubtedly the concurrent agricultural revolution and industrial revolution. The agricultural revolution, which began earlier but gathered pace in the 18th century, transformed farming through enclosure, consolidating scattered landholdings into larger, more efficient farms. The adoption of new farming techniques, like the Norfolk four-course rotation, the introduction of new crops, turnips, clover, selective breeding of livestock, and the use of more efficient tools, agricultural productivity soared. This fed a rapidly growing population and released surplus labor from the countryside to work in the emerging industries, while also generating capital for investment. The Industrial Revolution was an even more profound and far-reaching technological and economic transformation, generally considered to have begun in the latter half of the 18th century. It started primarily in the textile industry. A series of crucial inventions revolutionized cotton production. John Kay's flying shuttle, James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Richard Arkwright's water frame, Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, and Edmund Cartwright's power loom dramatically increased efficiency. But the true engine driving the Industrial Revolution was the improvement and widespread application of the steam engine. James Watt's critical enhancements to the earlier Newcomen engine in the 1760s to 1780s made steam power far more efficient and versatile. Steam engines provided a reliable power source for factories, freeing them from reliance on water power, and revolutionized transportation. The development of the steam locomotive and railways by pioneers like George Stephenson, alongside the advent of steamships, fundamentally changed land and sea travel, vastly accelerating the movement of goods and people. The coal and iron industries boomed in tandem. Coal became the primary fuel source. Advances in iron production, like Abraham Darby's use of coke for smelting and Henry Court's puddling process, led to a massive increase in iron output, providing the essential material for machinery, railways, and bridges. The Industrial Revolution led to the rise of the factory system, shifting production from small domestic workshops to large, centralized factories. Urbanization accelerated dramatically as people flocked from rural areas to new industrial towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool. This rapid growth, however, brought severe problems: overcrowding, poor sanitation, pollution, and harsh working conditions. A new social structure emerged, dominated by the industrial bourgeoisie, factory owners, bankers, and the vast industrial proletariat, factory workers. Working conditions were often appalling, with long hours, low pay, and widespread child labor, sparking early forms of worker protest and calls for social reform. While industry boomed at home, Great Britain's global power was also expanding rapidly. Throughout the 18th century, Britain engaged in fierce global competition with its main rival, France. Through a series of major wars, including the War of the Spanish Succession, gaining Gibraltar and Newfoundland, the War of the Austrian Succession, and the decisive 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Britain emerged triumphant. During the 7 Years' War, forces led by figures like Robert Clive secured dominance in India, defeating French allies at battles like Plassey, paving the way for British rule primarily through the East India Company. In North America, Britain captured France's vast colonies in Canada, New France, and east of the Mississippi River. By the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain stood as the world's preeminent colonial power. Imperial success, however, came at a cost. Attempts by the British government to levy new taxes on the North American colonies, like the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, to help pay for the 7 Years' War provoked fierce resistance. Colonists rallied around the principle of no taxation without representation, arguing they should not be taxed by a parliament in which they had no elected representatives. Tensions escalated through events like the Boston Tea Party, leading to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775. Supported by France and other European rivals of Britain, the colonies issued the Declaration of Independence in 1776. After a long and difficult war, Britain was defeated, recognizing American independence in 1783. The loss of the 13 colonies was a major blow, But it also prompted Britain to shift its imperial focus increasingly towards Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, explored by Captain Cook. From the late 18th century into the early 19th, Britain found itself locked in another protracted struggle: the wars against revolutionary and Napoleonic France, 1793 to 1815. This conflict posed an existential threat. Under prime ministers like William Pitt the Younger, Britain leveraged its naval supremacy, secured by victories like Lord Nelson's triumph at the Battle of Trafalgar, and its growing economic strength, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, to lead and finance coalitions against France. The long wars culminated in the final defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, commanded by the Duke of Wellington. Victory in the Napoleonic Wars left Britain in an unparalleled position of global dominance. It had eliminated its most potent rival, secured mastery of the seas, consolidated its vast empire, and laid the foundations for the century of relative global peace, enforced by British power, known as Pax Britannica. Furthermore, the Act of Union 1800 had formally merged the Kingdom of Great Britain with the Kingdom of Ireland, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The name still largely in use today, though the Irish question would continue to fester. That concludes Chapter 5. The Georgian era saw Britain consolidate into a unified kingdom and transform its economy through the agricultural and industrial revolutions. On the world stage, it defeated its main rivals, and despite losing its American colonies, laid the groundwork for an even larger empire, emerging as the world's leading power after the Napoleonic Wars. Industrialization and urbanization also brought new social structures and immense challenges. Next, we enter the Victorian era, witnessing the zenith of the British Empire, peak industrial might, and the social contradictions simmering beneath the surface of prosperity. Chapter 6: The Victorian Era: Power, Progress, and Paradox. In 1837, an 18-year-old Victoria ascended the throne, succeeding her uncle William IV. Her reign would last an extraordinary 63 years, 1837 to 1901, defining an entire epoch, the Victorian era. This period is widely regarded as the high-water mark of British power and influence, an age of immense confidence, industrial might, and imperial expansion, yet also one marked by stark social contrasts and underlying anxieties. Imperial zenith, and the empire on which the sun never sets. The Victorian era witnessed the British Empire reach its greatest extent. Through colonization, trade, and military force, Britain forged a global empire covering nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and ruling over roughly a quarter of its population. From settler colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand gaining increasing self-government, to the vast Indian subcontinent, where the Crown took direct control from the East India Company after the Indian Mutiny of 1857, with Victoria proclaimed Empress of India in 1877, to territories acquired across Africa during the Scramble for Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. The Union Jack flew across the globe. This truly was the empire on which the sun never sets. The powerful Royal Navy dominated the world's oceans, protecting trade routes and enforcing British interests, maintaining the so-called Pax Britannica, a British peace, though often imposed by force and accompanied by exploitation. Key imperial conflicts included the Opium Wars against China, the Crimean War against Russia alongside France and the Ottoman Empire, the Indian Mutiny, the Zulu War, and the Boer Wars in South Africa. Industrial, technological, and economic leadership. As the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, Britain remained the world's leading industrial power for much of the Victorian era, often called the workshop of the world. Its output of coal, iron, steel, and textiles was immense. Railways crisscrossed the nation and extended into the empire. Steamships dominated global shipping. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the magnificent Crystal Palace in London's Hyde Park, showcased Britain's industrial prowess and wealth to the world, becoming a potent symbol of Victorian confidence and achievement. Science and technology continued to advance rapidly. Charles Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859 proposed the theory of evolution by natural selection, revolutionizing biology and challenging traditional beliefs. Figures like Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell made foundational contributions to the understanding of electricity and magnetism, paving the way for future technologies. The telegraph and telephone began to shrink distances. London solidified its position as the world's financial center. Political reform and social change. The Victorian political landscape was largely dominated by the rivalry between the Liberal Party, successors to the Whigs, led by figures like William Gladstone, who served 4 terms as Prime Minister, and the Conservative Party, successors to the Tories, led by figures like Benjamin Disraeli, twice Prime Minister. Although Queen Victoria reigned for a long time, the actual political power of the monarch continued to decline, and the system of parliamentary democracy matured. This era also saw a series of crucial political and social reforms. Parliamentary reform. The Great Reform Act of 1832 began the process of modernizing the electoral system, redistributing seats, and extending the franchise to more middle-class men, though property qualifications remained. Subsequent reform acts in 1867 and 1884 further extended voting rights to many working-class men, moving Britain closer to universal male suffrage, though women's suffrage remained a major unresolved issue. Social legislation. Faced with the severe social problems spawned by industrialization, poverty, horrific working conditions, urban squalor, the government began to intervene more actively. Factory acts gradually limited working hours for children and women. Public health acts aimed to improve sanitation and water supplies in towns. Education acts began establishing a system of compulsory elementary education. Abolitionism. Britain had banned the slave trade in 1807. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 abolished slavery throughout most of the British Empire, though compensation was paid to slave owners. Trade unionism. The working class increasingly organized to fight for better wages and conditions. Trade unions gradually gained legal recognition and became a significant social force. The Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s was a major working-class campaign, demanding political reforms, including universal male suffrage. While its immediate goals failed, it influenced later democratic reforms. Victorian society, values and contradictions. The Victorian era is renowned for its distinct social codes and values, often summarized as Victorian values. These emphasized hard work, thrift, duty, religious observance, family respectability, and a strict, often publicly proclaimed, moral code, particularly regarding sexuality, often marked by hypocrisy and double standards. The middle class rose to prominence, becoming the dominant social force and setting the moral tone. However, beneath the surface of progress and propriety lay deep social divisions and contradictions. Extreme inequality. Opulence for the aristocracy and the new industrial elite coexisted with grinding poverty and appalling living conditions for much of the working class, especially in urban slums. Writers like Charles Dickens vividly portrayed these realities in novels, such as Oliver Twist and Hard Times. The dark side of empire. Imperial glory was built on conquest, exploitation, and often brutal suppression of colonial peoples, underpinned by widespread racist attitudes and the destruction of indigenous cultures. Subordinate status of women. Despite having a queen on the throne, Victorian women were legally, politically, and economically subordinate to men, confined primarily to the domestic sphere as the angel in the house. The movement for women's suffrage gained momentum in the later Victorian era, but faced fierce opposition. The Irish question. Relations between Britain and Ireland remained deeply troubled. The devastating Great Famine of the 1840s, caused by potato blight, but exacerbated by British government inaction or inadequate response, led to mass starvation and emigration, fueling bitter resentment against British rule. The campaign for Irish Home Rule self-government became a major and divisive issue in British politics throughout the late Victorian period. Challenges at the end of the era. By the late 19th century, Britain's industrial and economic dominance began to face serious challenges from newly industrializing powers, particularly Germany and the United States. the international climate grew more tense, with increasing competition among European powers leading to an arms race and setting the stage for the conflicts of the 20th century. Domestically, the labor movement became more organized and militant, socialist ideas gained ground, and the campaign for women's rights intensified. The apparent stability and self-assurance of the high Victorian era were beginning to crack. In summary, the Victorian era was the time when the British Empire reached its zenith, characterized by immense power, industrial strength, technological progress, and cultural confidence. Yet, it was also an age of profound paradox, marked by deep social inequalities, the often brutal realities of empire, and emerging challenges both at home and abroad. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 wasn't just the end of a long reign. It symbolized the passing of a glorious but deeply flawed era. Next, we move into the tumultuous 20th century to witness the cataclysms of two world wars, the decline of empire, the rise of the welfare state, and the dramatic transformation of British society. Chapter 7: World Wars and the Welfare State, Imperial Sunset and Social Transformation. After the Victorian era came the relatively brief Edwardian era, 1901 to 1910, named after King Edward VII. Often seen as a final, gilded age of peace and prosperity before the storm, it was also a time of simmering tensions. While the upper classes enjoyed elegance and leisure, issues of poverty, militant trade unionism, the increasingly radical women's suffrage movement, the suffragettes, and the unresolved question of Irish Home Rule intensified. The Liberal government of the time did introduce important social reforms, like old age pensions and national insurance, laying early foundations for the welfare state. However, beneath the surface calm, international tensions were mounting rapidly. Europe divided into two hostile military alliances: the Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Allied Powers, or Entente, primarily Britain, France, and Russia. An escalating arms race, especially the Anglo-German naval rivalry, colonial competition, and nationalist conflicts in the Balkans created a powder keg. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo ignited the First World War, 1914 to 1918, often called the Great War. Britain initially hoped to stay out, but Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium prompted Britain to declare war, citing treaty obligations, but also driven by the strategic imperative to prevent German domination of the Channel coast. Initial expectations of a short conflict, home by Christmas, were brutally shattered. The war quickly bogged down into horrific trench warfare, particularly on the Western Front. Millions endured unimaginable conditions of mud, disease, and constant shelling, resulting in catastrophic casualties. Battles like the Somme, 1916, where the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, and Passchendaele, 1917, became bywords for the senseless slaughter and futility of the conflict. The war profoundly impacted British society, devastating human cost. Nearly 1 million British and Empire soldiers died, and millions more were wounded, leaving a deep scar on society, the lost generation. Expansion of state power. Total war required unprecedented government intervention in the economy and daily life, including conscription, rationing, and state control of industries. Changing role of women. With millions of men at the front, women took on vital roles in factories, farms, and support services, challenging traditional gender roles. Their contribution was partially recognized after the war when, in 1918, women over 30 meeting property qualifications gained the vote. Equal suffrage with men followed in 1928. Economic ruin. The war drained Britain's wealth, transforming it from the world's largest creditor nation into a debtor nation, and severely weakening its economy. Imperial strain. While the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., and colonies provided crucial troops and resources, strengthening imperial ties for some, the shared sacrifice also fueled nationalist sentiments and demands for greater autonomy. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916, though suppressed, galvanized the independence movement, leading to the post-war Irish War of Independence, and the creation of the Irish Free State in 1921, excluding 6 northern counties that remained in the UK, marking the first major contraction of the British Empire. The war ended on November 11, 1918, with an Allied victory, but the trauma and cost left a legacy of disillusionment and a deep longing for peace. The interwar period saw brief prosperity followed by severe economic hardship, especially during the Great Depression triggered in 1929, which caused mass unemployment and social unrest in Britain, e.g., the General Strike of 1926. Internationally, Britain supported the League of Nations, but struggled to maintain peace in the face of rising fascist aggression in Germany, Italy, and Japan. The dominant policy became appeasement, attempting to avoid war by conceding to dictators' demands. The most notorious example was the Munich Agreement of 1938, where Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sacrificed Czechoslovakia, famously claiming to have secured peace for our time. Appeasement ultimately failed. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, forcing Britain and France to declare war, beginning the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. World War II was an even greater existential struggle for Britain. After the fall of France in 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, facing the imminent threat of invasion. It was during this darkest hour that Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, rallying the nation with his defiant spirit and iconic speeches. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We shall never surrender." Key moments for Britain included the Dunkirk evacuation, 1940, rescuing hundreds of thousands of Allied troops from France. The Battle of Britain, 1940, the Royal Air Force, RAF, successfully defended British airspace against the Luftwaffe, thwarting Hitler's invasion plans. The Blitz, 1940 to 1941, sustained German bombing raids on London and other cities caused immense destruction, but failed to break British morale. The long battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats to keep vital supply lines open. Britain's crucial role alongside its allies, primarily the US and Soviet Union, in campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and the Normandy landings, D-Day, in 1944, leading to final victory. World War II again reshaped British society profoundly. Shared sacrifice and total mobilization. The war directly impacted the home front, the People's War, fostering a sense of national unity and shared experience, which fueled demands for a fairer post-war society. Economic exhaustion. The war effort left Britain bankrupt, heavily reliant on American aid, the Marshall Plan, for recovery. Accelerated imperial decline. The war further weakened Britain's global position and prestige. Japanese victories in Asia shattered the myth of European invincibility. Wartime promises and the post-war rise of anti-colonial movements made maintaining the empire unsustainable. The independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Creation of the welfare state. The shared hardships of war and depression created a strong consensus for social reform. In a surprise result, Churchill's Conservatives lost the 1945 general election to the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee. Attlee's government, guided by the blueprint of the Beveridge Report, 1942, embarked on a radical program of reform, establishing the modern welfare state. The crowning achievement was the creation in 1948 of the National Health Service, NHS, providing universal healthcare free at the point of use. Other major reforms included the nationalization of key industries, coal, rail, steel, expanded social insurance, and new education policies. These changes fundamentally altered British society and established the post-war consensus that would dominate politics for decades. That concludes Chapter 7. The first half of the 20th century saw Britain endure the cataclysms of 2 world wars, paying a heavy price in lives and treasure, leading to the decline of its global power and the dismantling of its empire. Yet, these experiences also catalyzed profound social change, culminating in the creation of the welfare state, an attempt to build a more secure and equitable society for all. The sunset of empire and the dawn of the welfare state set the stage for post-war Britain. Next, we explore Britain from the post-war era to the present day, examining its role in the Cold War, ongoing socioeconomic transformations, its evolving relationship with Europe, and the new challenges of the 21st century. Chapter 8. Post-war Britain to the present. Change, challenge, and contemporary UK. Emerging from World War II victorious but battered, Britain faced a depleted economy and a rapidly dissolving empire. In the new Cold War era, Britain aligned firmly with the United States, becoming a founding member of NATO and investing heavily in its own nuclear deterrent to maintain its great power status, successfully testing an atomic bomb in 1952. However, the Suez Crisis of 1956, a failed Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt, aborted under pressure from the US and USSR, starkly exposed Britain's diminished international influence and is often seen as a symbolic end to its superpower pretensions. Meanwhile, the process of decolonization gathered pace. Starting with India and Pakistan in 1947, most of Britain's colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean gained independence, particularly during the 1960s. Britain sought to maintain influence through the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies, but the age of empire was definitively over. Decolonization also spurred significant immigration from Commonwealth countries to Britain, as people sought new opportunities. This profoundly reshaped Britain's demographics, creating an increasingly multicultural society, but also bringing challenges related to race relations and social integration that continue to be debated. Domestically, the post-war consensus largely held sway for several decades. Both major parties, Labour and Conservative, broadly accepted the welfare state, a mixed economy, with significant state ownership alongside private enterprise, and Keynesian demand management. The 1950s and early 1960s saw sustained economic growth and rising living standards. This period also witnessed significant cultural shifts, including the rise of youth culture, the global phenomenon of rock and roll, spearheaded by bands like the Beatles, and the vibrant swinging London scene of the mid-60s. However, from the late 1960s onwards, the British economy began to falter. Growth slowed, inflation rose, and international competitiveness declined, leading to talk of the British disease. The 1970s were particularly difficult, marked by oil crises, industrial decline, strained labor relations, and powerful trade unions leading frequent strikes, culminating in the widespread disruption of the Winter of Discontent in 1978 to 79. This period of economic malaise and social strife paved the way for the election victory of the Conservative Party, led by Margaret Thatcher, in 1979. Thatcher served as Prime Minister for 11 years, 1979 to 1990, ushering in the transformative and controversial Thatcher era. She implemented a radical set of free market reforms, known as Thatcherism, aimed at reversing Britain's perceived decline. Large-scale privatization, selling off state-owned industries like British Telecom, British Airways, British Gas, and Utilities, curbing trade union power through legislation and confrontation, most famously during the bitter year-long miners' strike of 1984 to 85. Monetarist policies to control inflation, tax cuts, particularly for higher earners and corporations, reductions in public spending, though the core structures of the welfare state largely remained. Thatcher's reforms arguably revitalized parts of the British economy and broke the power of obstructive unions, but they also led to a sharp increase in social inequality, the devastating decline of traditional heavy industries, like coal mining in the north, and deep societal divisions. In foreign policy, she cultivated a reputation for toughness, notably leading Britain to victory in the Falklands War against Argentina in 1982, which boosted her popularity. However, her deep Euroscepticism strained relations with European partners. Thatcher was forced from office by her own party in 1990. The Conservatives remained in power under John Major until 1997. This period saw Britain join the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, ERM, only to be forced into a humiliating withdrawal on Black Wednesday in 1992, damaging the government's economic credibility. In 1997, Tony Blair led the rebranded New Labour Party to a landslide election victory. Ending 18 years of conservative rule, Blair advocated a third-way philosophy, seeking a synthesis between market economics and social justice. His government presided over a period of sustained economic growth and increased investment in public services like education and the NHS. Blair also pursued significant constitutional reforms, devolution, establishing devolved parliaments/assemblies with substantial powers in Scotland and Wales, 1999, and restoring power sharing in Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement, 1998, which largely brought an end to the decades-long violent conflict known as the Troubles. The Human Rights Act 1998, incorporating the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. Reform of the House of Lords, removing the voting rights of most hereditary peers. However, the most controversial decision of Blair's premiership was his strong support for, and Britain's participation in, the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. The war's justification and consequences remain highly contentious in Britain, significantly damaging Blair's legacy. Blair resigned in 2007 and was succeeded by Gordon Brown. Brown's premiership was soon overshadowed by the global financial crisis of 2008, which hit Britain's large financial sector particularly hard. The government undertook massive bailouts of failing banks, leading to a dramatic increase in national debt. The 2010 general election resulted in a hung parliament, leading to the first peacetime coalition government since World War II, formed between the Conservatives under David Cameron and the Liberal Democrats led by Nick Clegg. The coalition implemented a program of austerity, involving significant public spending cuts to reduce the budget deficit, sparking intense debate about its impact on public services and social inequality. During the coalition years, Scottish nationalism surged. A Scottish independence referendum was held in 2014, with Scots ultimately voting 55% to 45% to remain part of the United Kingdom. Britain's relationship with Europe has been a dominant and often divisive theme throughout the post-war era. Having joined the European Economic Community (EC), precursor to the EU, in 1973, significant Euroscepticism persisted within the UK, fueled by concerns over sovereignty, immigration, and bureaucracy. Seeking to manage internal party divisions and respond to public pressure, David Cameron promised an in/out referendum on EU membership if the Conservatives won the 2015 election. After winning a surprise majority in 2015, Cameron fulfilled his promise. The Brexit referendum was held on June 23, 2016. In a shock result, 51.9% voted to leave the European Union, against 48.1% who voted to remain. The outcome stunned the world and led to Cameron's resignation. His successor, Theresa May, formally triggered the Article 50 withdrawal process, but negotiations with the EU proved tortuous, and her proposed withdrawal agreement was repeatedly rejected by Parliament, plunging British politics into deadlock. In 2019, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, promising to get Brexit done. He secured a large Conservative majority in a snap general election later that year. The UK formally left the European Union on January 31, 2020, and exited the transition period at the end of that year, embarking on a new relationship with the EU based on a trade agreement. Post-Brexit, the UK faces ongoing challenges, defining its new role on the world stage, managing the complex new relationship with the EU, and dealing with the economic and social consequences of leaving, including persistent issues surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol. Compounding these challenges, the global COVID-19 pandemic from early 2020 onwards had a devastating impact on public health, the economy, and society. Recent years have seen continued political turbulence. Boris Johnson resigned in 2022 following scandals like Partygate. His successor, Liz Truss, lasted only 49 days after her radical unfunded tax cuts caused market chaos, making her the shortest-serving PM in British history. Rishi Sunak then took office, confronting high inflation, a cost-of-living crisis, severe pressures on the NHS, and the geopolitical fallout from the war in Ukraine. The nation also marked the end of an era with the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022 after a historic 70-year reign. Her son, Charles III, acceded to the throne, opening a new chapter for the monarchy. That brings us to the end of Chapter 8, and the final leg of our journey through British history. From the twilight of empire and the shadow of the Cold War, through decolonization, immigration, and the making of a multicultural society, from the welfare state consensus to the free market revolution of Thatcherism, from embracing Europe to the seismic decision of Brexit, and into the 21st century grappling with financial crisis, austerity, questions of national unity, the profound impacts of leaving the EU, a global pandemic, and persistent socio-economic challenges. Contemporary Britain continues to navigate change, adapt, and forge its path forward. Conclusion. And there we have it, friends. We've journeyed together through thousands of years of British history. From the ancient stones of Stonehenge to the skyscrapers of modern London, from Celtic tribes to today's multicultural society, from Roman province to the empire on which the sun never set, and now to a United Kingdom redefining its place in the world. We've witnessed conquest and resistance, unity and division, reform and revolution, glory and decline. We've traced the long struggle between crown and parliament, the profound influence of religion, the earth-shattering impact of the Industrial Revolution, and the complex legacy of empire. We've encountered countless individuals, monarchs, politicians, thinkers, artists, scientists, and ordinary people, who together shaped this extraordinary story. Of course, in just several hours we could only scratch the surface of such a rich and complex history. Countless details, controversies, and alternative interpretations couldn't be fully explored. But I hope this overview has provided a helpful framework and a clearer understanding of the main currents that have shaped Britain. Britain's story is, of course, still being written. The challenges it faces today, economic, social, political, resonate with those faced by many nations in our interconnected world. Understanding its past is crucial, not just for understanding Britain today, but for reflecting on its future, and perhaps on the wider world we all share. Thank you so much for your time and attention throughout this long journey. If you enjoyed this video and found it informative, please do hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and consider sharing it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel for more deep dives into history and culture.